Your labor-intensive executive functions need every neuron they can get, but a negative inner voice hogs our neural capacity. Verbal rumination concentrates our attention narrowly on the source of our emotional distress, thus stealing neurons that could better serve us. In effect, we jam our executive functions up by attending to a dual task: the task of doing whatever it is we want to do, and the task of listening to our pained inner voice. Neurologically, that's how chatter divides and blurs our attention. All of us are familiar with the distractions of a negative verbal stream. Have you ever tried to read a book or complete a task requiring focus after a bad fight with someone you love? It's next to impossible. All the resulting negative thoughts consume your executive functions because your inner critic and its ranting have taken over corporate headquarters, raiding your neuronal resources. The problem for most of us, however, is that usually we're engaged in activities with much higher stakes than retaining information in a book. We're doing our jobs, pursuing our dreams, interacting with others, and being evaluated. Chatter in the form of repetitive, anxious thought is a marvelous saboteur when it comes to focused tasks. Countless studies reveal its debilitating effects. It leads students to perform worse on tests, produces stage fright and a tendency to catastrophize among artistic performers, and undermines negotiations in business. One study found, for instance, that anxiety led people to make low initial offers, exit discussions early, and earn less money. This is a very nice way of saying they failed at their jobs because of chatter. On any given day, the keel of our inner voice can be thrown askew by an infinite number of things. When this happens, we have trouble focusing our minds to address the inevitable daily challenges we face, which often produces still more turbulence in our inner dialogues. Quite naturally, when we're floundering like this, we look for a way out of our predicament. So, what exactly do we do? That's a question a middle-aged, mild-mannered psychologist became intrigued with some 30 years ago. His research would raise profound questions about the costs of chatter that go far beyond our ability to focus our attention. Our inner voice affects our social lives as well. A social repellent. In the late 1980s, a bespectacled Belgian psychologist named Bernard Ramey decided to examine whether experiencing the kinds of strong negative emotions that characterize chatter lead people to engage in a very social process: talking. Over the course of several studies, Ramey brought people into his laboratory and asked them whether they talked about negative experiences from their past with others. Then he turned his focus to the present and asked people to record in diaries over the course of several weeks each time they confronted an upsetting situation and whether they discussed it with members of their social networks. He also ran experiments in which he provoked participants in the lab and then watched if they shared their reactions with others nearby. Again and again, Ramey landed on the same finding. People feel compelled to talk to others about their negative experiences. But that wasn't all. The more intense the emotion was, the more they wanted to talk about it. Additionally, they returned to talking about what had occurred more often, doing so repeatedly over the course of hours, days, weeks, and months, and sometimes even for the remainder of their lives. Ramey's findings proved true regardless of people's age or education level. It was characteristic of men as well as women. It even carried across geography and cultures. From Asia to the Americas to Europe, he kept finding the same thing. Strong emotions acted like a jet propellant, blasting people off to share their experiences. It seemed to be a law of human nature. The only exceptions to this rule were cases in which people felt shame, which they often wished to conceal, or certain forms of trauma, which they wanted to avoid dwelling on. Such consistency in a finding was stunning, though it may sound like a confirmation of the obvious. As we all know, people talk a lot about intense emotions. It's not as if we go around calling friends to say, "Hey, I feel fairly normal today." It's the highs and lows that leap from the verbal stream in our minds to the words that leave our mouths. While this sounds normal and harmless, repeatedly sharing our negative inner voice with others produces one of the great ironies of chatter in social life. We voice the thoughts in our minds to the sympathetic listeners we know in search of their support. But doing so excessively ends up pushing away the people we need most. It's as though the pain of chatter makes people less sensitive to the normal social cues that tell us when enough is enough. To be clear, this doesn't mean that talking to others about your problems is harmful per se, but it highlights how chatter can transform an otherwise helpful experience into something negative. Many of us have a limited threshold for how much venting we can listen to, even from the people we love, as well as how often we can tolerate this venting while not feeling listened to ourselves. Relationships thrive on reciprocity. That's one of the reasons why therapists charge us for their time and friends don't. When this conversational balance becomes lopsided, social connections fray. To make matters worse, when this occurs, the people who are overventing and inadvertently alienating those around them are less capable of solving problems. This makes it harder for them to fix the breach in their relationships, begetting a vicious cycle that can end with a toxic outcome: loneliness and isolation. For a heightened example of how this process of progressive social isolation operates, we can look to that widespread emotional tumult known as middle school. One study tracked more than 1,000 middle schoolers for 7 months and found that kids who were prone to rumination reported talking with their peers more than their low rumination counterparts. Yet, this did more harm than good. It predicted a host of painful results: being socially excluded and rejected, being the target of gossip and rumors by their peers, and even being threatened with violence. Unfortunately, in this case, what is true of preteens and teens crosses over to adulthood. Furthermore, it turns out it doesn't matter much even if you have a legitimate reason for venting. Overvoicing your chatter can still push people away. One study that focused on grieving adults found that people who were prone to ruminate reached out for more social support after their loss, which is normal. The uncomfortable twist, though, is that they reported experiencing more social friction and less emotional support in their relationships as a result. Uncontrolled emotional sharing isn't the only type of social repellent that chatter enables. People who perseverate on conflicts are also more likely to behave aggressively. One experiment showed that cueing people to ruminate about how they felt after being insulted by an experimenter who undiplomatically criticized an essay they had written led them to be more hostile with the person who insulted them. When given the chance to administer loud blasts of noise to the experimenter, they did so more than people who didn't ruminate. In other words, the more I stew over what you did to me, the more I keep those negative feelings alive, and the more likely I am to act aggressively against you as a result. Chatter also leads us to displace our aggression against people when they don't deserve it. Our boss upsets us, for example, and we take it out on our kids. But none of this research considers our digital lives. In the age of online sharing, Rimé's work on emotions in our social lives has acquired a new